15 minutes.
Thank you. I can call to the matters being discussed before the House today are without doubt the most harrowing and distressing that this House has ever dealt with. And in speaking here today, I'm extremely conscious of the victims of child sexual abuse. The fact that their words and their stories communicate far better than I ever would. The enormity of the violence and violation visited upon many of the children in this country over the years. Nonetheless, I recognise that as a TD, I too have responsibility to my constituents to speak here today. I'm very conscious of those who suffered at the hands of a small coterie of paedophile teachers in my constituency of Laois Offaly. I've met some of these people. I'd like to take this opportunity to commend them for their strength of spirit, their courage, and their refusal to give up the fight for justice in the face of almost insurmountable difficulties. We have reached a critical juncture in respect of the governance of this state. Now clear that as a country we have grossly let down and neglected the most vulnerable in our care. When these victims bravely came forward to tell their stories, they were generally ignored or dismissed for many decades. Reading the Ryan report and the litany of horrendous abuse which it documents, one of the most tragic aspects is that when these matters were brought to the attention of senior civil servants, the complaints which took so much courage to make were passed around from one section to another with a coldness and an indifference that's staggering in the context of the nature of the complaint. Chapter 14 of the Ryan report, which documents years of sustained sexual abuse of young boys and violent punishment of young boys and young girls in schools, primarily in Laois and Offaly, among other locations, reveals that when a brave victim sought to flag the Department of Education the fact that a known paedophile remained on his payroll, his complaint was passed around like an unwanted gift, each official dismissing it in turn to another. This was the critical time at which the state and its servants, which had failed its children so monumentally, could have shown a modicum of compassion. But once again, the door was slammed in the face of the victims. There's a widespread view that perpetrators described in the Ryan report should face criminal prosecution, and I wholeheartedly support this view. However, I believe there are questions to be answered about the actions of senior officials in the Department of Education who were aware of complaints of child abuse and either passed the buck or looked the other way. These Pontius Pilates have a case to answer to the victims. Strange attitude that the state has historically taken towards those who have suffered in its schools and other institutions persists to this day. Louise O'Keeffe, a woman sexually abused by her national school principal in Cork in the 1970s, was recently pursued for costs by the state following an unsuccessful attempt to sue the state on the basis of vicarious liability. It took the Supreme Court to show some humanity, and it duly refused to award costs to the state. This vicious attitude on the part of government, and there's a minister sitting opposite in that department. This vicious attitude adopted by the government to go after the victims of child sex abuse in the courts, fight to the bitter end, the beleaguered parents of autistic children who are fighting for their children's education, is most disturbing. Moreover, it's wholly inconsistent with the attitude the state has taken in relation to the religious congregations. Why is the state happy to pick up the tab for the religious congregations following a series of cosy chats between Minister Woods, his Secretary-General and the representatives of the orders? It was almost the universal view at the time that a 50-50 arrangement on the indemnity would be a good deal for the religious. Yet Minister Woods and Secretary-General Dennehy agreed to pay what will amount to 90% of the costs. Yet when a victim attempts to find justice in the court, the state throws the kitchen sink at it to win the case and crush the plaintiff. Similarly, a bank need only ask when the state coffers are opened how much they want. Compare this to the attitude towards the victims of abuse. This state has found itself a convenient legal loophole regarding the management of our primary schools. It has argued, and regrettably the courts have agreed, that primary schools are managed by boards of management. The Supreme Court judgment in the Louise O'Keeffe case supported the state's view that it could not be held vicariously liable for the actions of primary school employees and thus owed no duty of care to victims of paedophile teachers. Boards of management conveniently are made up of mainly voluntary people. They have scant resources, spend a lot of time simply trying to keep the show on the road, while in the meantime the department has the privilege of power without responsibility. It decides on teaching standards, it decides on curriculum, it issues circulars laying down the law about almost every aspect of school life. But when a victim such as Louise O'Keeffe appears, it runs a mile and claims the Board of Management is in charge. This strange arrangement is, in my view, neither moral nor sustainable. Even Government Chief Whip Pat Carey recently referred to it as a cop-out. I recognise that religious congregations have done a great deal for the people of Ireland over the years. But this does not mean that they're members of more rights than other citizens. It does not make criminals who cloak themselves in a religious mantle immune to justice. It does not sweep aside the rights of victims. It does not mean the state should roll over for religious orders and go after victims like Louise O'Keeffe in the courts. There is a schizophrenia endemic in this contradictory approach that must be addressed by this House as one of urgency. The state must be on the side of the citizen and must be seen to be on the side of the citizen. There remains little evidence that the state is truly on the side of citizens or even victims. And I'm saying now that we need a fundamental change in the attitudes of all the relevant players: government, civil servants, political servants, and politicians generally towards the people of this state, towards the individuals who have suffered injustice and now seek justice. Lip service and window dressing are not enough. We must move away from the traditional notion that allegations are easy to make and difficult to prove, that those who complain are troublemakers. Such attitudes are relics of an old Ireland where voiceless children were beaten and abused by those thought to have been above reproach, while the rest of the nation, its government, its citizenry, turned a blind eye. As I mentioned earlier, I have a particular interest in Chapter 14 of the Ryan Report, which refers to an individual who visited a reign of terror upon children in his care over a 40-year period. John Brander is the name he is given in the report. This depraved paedophile left the Christian Brothers at the request of his superiors in the 1950s, following at least 3 complaints of sexual abuse to young boys. As the Ryan Report points out, I quote, "By this means, Brother Brander was able to leave the congregation apparently of his own volition, but with an unblemished teaching record," unquote. This reprehensible individual moved from school to school, including several in my own constituency, terrorising children, sexually abusing boys, beating the small children of both genders in his care to a vicious and depraved degree. All the while, he was sycophantically buttered up by his colleagues, superiors, and neighbours. He cultivated power in the local community. After a reign of terror in the school, he would eventually move when the tide of complaints by parents became too much, and he would always be given a glowing reference despite the litany of complaints and the number of investigations. It took until the 1990s before this man was prosecuted. For 40 years, he did as he pleased in school after school throughout the Midlands. Investigations have shown that the bulk of the abuse perpetrated in general was not known to the Department of Education. However, the case of John Brander was brought to the attention of the Department of Education as early as 1965 and again in the early 1980s when one of his victims made sustained attempts to alert officials in the department to the danger this man was to children. The Ryan Report documents a complaint made by the mother of a child in Rath National School, Ballypritis, in 1965, where she drew attention to excessive use of corporal punishment, including beatings around the head sustained by her young children. This enlightened woman also included the name and address of the local doctor. Her complaint was forwarded to the parish priest and a request was made for a written report from Mr. Brander on the matter. The parish priest replied with a staunch defence of Mr. Brander, whose own report on the matter was so condescending that this alone should have sent alarm bells ringing in the department. He refers to the fact that the mother would be interested in the type of punishment meted out to her children as, I quote, "typical of the atmosphere of that house," unquote. Claims that bruises were likely to result from vigorous football. Nonetheless, the department sent an inspector to the school, in what smacks of an old boys network, the inspector concluded that the complaint should not be taken seriously, despite an acknowledgement by Mr. Brander that he was hot-tempered, and the department's own guidelines which directed that corporal punishment should only be administered for, I quote, "a grave transgression." Mr. Brander worked for 2 years in Rath before continuing the abuse of young children at Welsh Island School in County Offaly. In that school, severe physical and sexual abuse was a daily occurrence for the pupils for over 3 years. Eventually, some parents approached the Gardaí, much to the consternation of the parish priest, who indicated that he would have preferred to deal with the matter quietly himself. That is, one assumes, in the manner in which all other complaints about Mr. Brander had been held. A victim of Mr. Brander, identified in the report as Mr. Roth, contacted the department in the early 1980s. Initially, he briefed an acquaintance who was a department national school inspector about his concerns. The inspector took no action. Despite concern that complaining would adversely affect his own position, the victim took the brave step of formally writing to the department, warning them that Mr. Brander, who was at the time teaching in Tullamore, was a danger to young children. This letter was passed from Billy to Jack in the Department of Education, with nobody willing to follow up on its serious contents. Departmental memoranda from various officials spoke in strangely detached terms about Mr. Brander's status as a recognised teacher and examined the issue from a salary aspect. However, it noted, presumably primary branch has a file about the alleged misbehaviour in a primary school on this teacher's part, and in a later memorandum quoted in the Ryan report, it stated that there isn't much point in proceeding in this matter now, ending with a question, is it correct to rake up the past now? Noting that the inspection reports relating to Brander were positive, the department officials again decided to take no action. The exchange of memoranda by the department officials is shameful. The pass the parcel and turn a blind eye attitude has been so well documented in relation to the Catholic Church was also endemic in the Department of Education. Those involved bear a heavy burden of responsibility on their conscience. The bizarre disappearance of letters from the file and the reappearance of information relating to Mr. Brander is a matter in Lasciancorla that I'm extremely concerned about. 1997, the Department of Education informed the Gardaí that no complaints had been made in relation to Brander. A spokesman for the Department of Education told the media there was no record of any complaint against Brander. I knew that was untrue, sought an adjournment debate here 10 years ago, as well as writing to the then Minister Micheál Martin in respect to the matter. This led to Minister Martin to admit rather belatedly that yes, a complaint did exist. He cited a mistake by a civil servant in question as the reason why the complaint of Mr. Roth was not identified in the initial response to a Dáil adjournment motion by me in November 1998. No mention of the complaint made by the Rath mother in the 1960s. That never appeared until the Ryan report was published. So who in the Department of Education was removing the information from the files of alleged paedophiles? How did this information miraculously reappear at the bitter end? It's very serious. It's sinister. And I want answers from the current Minister for Education as to how this could happen and what investigation was carried out to identify how this information could disappear and reappear without explanation and this House misled. And this didn't happen in the 1950s or 1960s. It happened when I was a member of this House and raised the matter with the then Minister for Education, Micheál Martin, and spoke to Minister Noel Dempsey personally about the issue. The victims of Mr. Brander are looking for answers as to what happened to these complaints, and that's the very least they are owed at this point in time. They're included in the report, yet these victims are excluded from the redress scheme. The litany of abuse detailed in Chapter 14 highlights how wrong it is to ignore those who suffered abuse in primary schools who are not in residential full-time care. And the state cannot persist in washing its hands of responsibility for the abuse that was perpetrated by teachers on its payroll. The approach to victims of abuse in primary schools must be changed, and we need to change legislation in this area to close the legal loophole that is allowing the Department of Education to shirk its responsibilities on a daily basis. I've concentrated in the few minutes available to me on the Brander issue. But the children of this country currently, as mentioned by Deputy Shatter, are owed more than a dull debate and hand-wringing by the powers that be. If the government truly cares about child welfare, and if it's truly sorry for the crimes perpetrated against vulnerable children in the past, it will now take concrete steps to save today's children from the fate of abuse and neglect. 30 foster children in my own constituency as we speak today, with no care plan, no care assistance. So I will conclude again by commending the bravery of abuse victims who have told their stories. Our thoughts are with them. But that is not sufficient, because our thoughts should inform policy and decision making in relation to the children of this nation now and in the future. Thank you.